Hey guys, in this video we're going to be looking at chapter 20 of the Ecce Romani textbook. It's called A Chance Encounter. And in this chapter we're going to come back to the perfect tense and really explore it in more detail. I know we started that in chapter 19, but what the book does is really chunks together chapters 19, 20, and 21 into one unit that they just broke it into three pieces. So the grammar is going to be a continuation, and in chapter 21 we'll come back and tie it all together. But in chapter 20 you're really going to get down into the gritty details of what's going on with the perfect tense. As usual, we want to start with the derivatives. And remember, we find these very valuable when we're studying the vocab because it gives you a chance to see how different words in Latin lead to English words. And this is useful not only for things like, expanding your vocabulary, but if you're trying to remember what a word means in Latin, sometimes knowing the derivative will spark your memory so that you can translate it faster and easier without always having to look the words up in the dictionary. To start, we're going to look at the word post, which in Latin means after. And this gives us a few English derivatives such as posterity, posthumous, post-war, even words like posterior. They all have the idea of after in them. So for instance, post-war is talking, just like it sounds, something that happened after a war. Another way you might remember this is thinking of the abbreviation PM, which means post meridiem in Latin. In English, the way we use this is when we're talking about time. Post meridiem, or PM, is talking about something in the afternoon. The root meridian is talking about the middle of the day. So if you're talking about post-meridium, you're talking about a time that happened after the middle of the day, or afternoon in English. The next word we have is medius, which means middle. And this is where we get words like medium, mediate, medieval, median, intermediary. They're all having to do with something being in the middle or the middle of something. And another good word to remember in English is Mediterranean. So this word usually refers to the Mediterranean Sea, but it has the root medi in it, which means middle, and terra, which means earth. The Mediterranean Sea is literally in between Europe and Africa. It's a sea that's in the middle of the earth, if you think of it that way. There's land on basically all sides of the Mediterranean Sea. So that's where that name comes from. The next word we're going to look at is mīles, which means soldier. And if we think of some words that come from this in English, you're going to see some pretty obvious derivatives. Words like military, militaristic, militia, they all have to do with soldiers. Another word that comes from this in English is mile. Now the connection might not be that obvious right away, but you can see the spelling is almost identical. What's happening here is a mile is a unit of distance, or a measurement of distance. And the Roman mile was how far a Roman soldier could march or walk in a certain number of steps. Now, the Roman mile is a little shorter than a modern mile, but you get the idea of what's going on here. It's a distance that's based on how far a soldier can walk. So the word mile does have a connection back to soldiers, and that's where we get it in English. The next word we're going to look at is optimus, which means best in English and in Latin. The words we get from this would be optimist, optimum, words like optimistic, optimal. They all have to do with something being the best. So whenever you see one of these derivatives, you're talking about something being the best, which I think you can really see in the derivative optimize, which is a term that we use a lot in English, and it means the same thing, something being the best. The next word is dico, dicere, which means to say or to tell. And in English, we get derivatives such as dictate, diction, contradict, ditto, even words like dictionary and verdict. They all have to do with saying something. So if you think of the word dictate, if you're dictating something to someone, you're telling them something. The same goes with contradict. Contra means against. So if you contradict someone, it means you're saying something against them. But the root of saying is very obvious in all of these derivatives with the dict. That's a stem that we see a lot whenever you're saying something. The next word is fābula, which means story. In English, we have pretty much the exact same word with fable and fabulous. Fable is something that's pretty easy to recognize as being a story. Fabulous has taken on a slightly different meaning in English, but the root is the same. It's something that's so out there and fantastic it has to be from a story. That's literally what fabulous means, but you can see the root coming from the Latin fābula in both of these words. The next word is narro narrare, which means to tell a story or to narrate something. And This brings us to the grammar for this chapter, and your book calls this the perfect tense part 2. The reason for that is you've already seen the perfect tense in chapter 19, and we've covered some basics of it, but in this chapter we're really going to dive in more with the endings and how you can take the perfect tense and compare it against the imperfect tense. So we're not quite done with the perfect after this chapter. We'll come back and review it in chapter 21. But the way your book has it set up is chapters 19, 20, and 21 are basically 3 ways of describing the same idea, the perfect tense. So we're going to dive into the grammar a little more in this chapter. Just for a quick recap, the perfect tense is what we use to describe an action that has been completed in the past. The word perfect comes from the Latin perfectus, meaning completed, which should help you remember its use. And we're going to see this is slightly different from the imperfect because the imperfect is something that happened in the past that was ongoing or uncompleted. That's the major difference between the two of these tenses, and we're going to explore it a little more as we go. So just to recap the tenses that we know, we have 3 different sentences here. You have Marcus musat, Marcus musabat, and Marcus musawet. The first sentence, musat, is in the present tense. You're saying Marcus mutters. And again, you can see the T ending is just simple present tense. Marcus mutters. The second sentence has the BAT, the imperfect infix of BA, is telling you you've changed the tense. So now it doesn't mean Marcus mutters. You're saying Marcus was muttering. And again, the reason you do that is you're trying to say that this happened in the past and it was ongoing. Marcus was muttering. The third sentence is in the perfect tense. You can recognize it because the V infix and the ending IT are giving it away as being perfect tense. So this ending is one that we saw last chapter. And you're simply saying Marcus muttered. And again, think about the difference. We're going to explore it a little more as we go, but think about the difference between Marcus was muttering and Marcus muttered. One is something that was ongoing in the past. The other is something that happened in the past and was over in a specific amount of time. So just to recap the perfect tense, we've seen that the perfect tense is used to describe actions that happened in the past and were completed in the past. In other words, they were not ongoing. And we've seen the perfect tense endings of IT for third person singular and erunt, E-R-U-N-T, for third person plural. And these basically mean either he, she, or it did something or they did something. You've also seen that the perfect tense uses an infix or a stem that's often a V, an S, a U, or an X. So this is a way of identifying the perfect tense when you see a Latin verb. And remember, some perfect stems are simply a lengthened vowel, which are much harder to spot. You have to really be paying attention to how the word is spelled, but once you get the hang of it, you'll be able to spot these more easily. This brings us to the perfect tense endings. So far we've seen the IT and the erunt, third person singular and plural. Now you have all 6 endings. So for first person you have E, second person isti, third person it. That's the singular side. For the plural you have imus, istis, erunt. And again, there's nothing really changed in how we translate this, it's just who's performing the action. So if you see a verb in Latin that ends in a long I, you're saying I did something. If it ends in an istis, you're saying you all did something. So again, really pay attention to the endings here. And you want to remember that the perfect tense verb endings are the same for all Latin verbs. Now the reason I highlight that is you don't have to worry about what conjugation a verb is. It's still going to use these 6 endings when it's in the perfect tense. This brings us to the next part of the grammar. Now that we have the perfect tense and the imperfect tense, we want to figure out what's the difference between the two of them. So remember, we said the imperfect tense is used when you have an action happening in the past over a period of time. That's the key phrase here. So in other words, it's an ongoing action without a set beginning or end point. The perfect tense, on the other hand, is a completed action. So in other words, it has a specific endpoint. And if you think to the example I just showed, it's the difference between Marcus was muttering, which is imperfect, and Marcus muttered, which is perfect. And we're going to look a little more at this as we go now. One way to think about this that I'll show you in class is to think about the difference between a photograph and a video. So if you're thinking back to, say, your 10th birthday party, you can look at it 2 different ways. You could look at either a photo or a video. They're both showing something that happened in the past, but a photo is one fixed moment in time, whereas a video is showing a longer period of time in the past. So you're getting a different experience depending on which one you're looking at. This is equivalent to the difference between the perfect and the imperfect tense. The perfect tense is like that snapshot photograph. It's something that happened, it was one fixed moment in time. The imperfect tense is more like a video, and you can hear this in the English. If I say Marcus walked, it's a snapshot. It happened and it was over. If I say Marcus was walking, it's an ongoing action. It's more like a video. So if you can keep in mind the idea of the perfect tense being a snapshot, the imperfect tense being a video, it might help you understand when we use them in Latin. And when you're translating anything in Latin that uses perfect or imperfect, if you understand the distinction between the two of them, it helps you understand what the speaker's trying to say, what type of action is happening. The second part of the grammar is a little more complicated. It's subordinate clauses. This is something that you might have heard in English class. You learn about a subordinate and a main clause, but in Latin there's a little bit of nuance to it. It should sound familiar, but it's a little tricky at first. To start, we want to think about what are subordinate clauses. And to do that, we want to look at this example sentence. So if you're looking here, we have while the Corneliuses eat dinner, the soldier tells a story. If you're looking at the first part of this sentence, you have dum Cornelii cenant. You can see while the Corneliuses eat dinner. It makes sense, but it kind of doesn't stand on its own as its own sentence. You couldn't necessarily walk up to someone and say, hey, while the Corneliuses eat dinner. It feels like something's missing. On the other side, mīles fābulam narrat sounds like a complete sentence because it is. The soldier tells a story. That could stand alone as its own thought. So there's two pieces to this sentence, but there is a distinct difference between the two of them. The first part of the sentence, the while the Corneliuses eat dinner, this is what we call the subordinate clause. And again, we're going to explore this as we go through the video, but if you think in English of what subordinate means, it often means someone who's, beneath someone else. Think of, a military ranking. Someone who ranks below someone is called a subordinate. It's a little bit less important. It's not quite a perfect way to think of this, but in Latin, the subordinate clause, and in English too, it's the part of the sentence that isn't quite as important. In other words, you could have a sentence without this piece. That's called the subordinate clause, and we're going to look at that in this video. So if you were to try and define a subordinate clause, one way to think about it is that it's a clause, and again, a clause just means it includes its own subject and verb. So a subordinate clause is one that provides additional information about the main clause of the sentence, but it doesn't stand alone as an independent sentence. So in other words, if you're thinking about the sentence I just showed, while the Corneliuses eat dinner, that can't stand alone as its own sentence. In Latin, the conjunction dum often introduces a subordinate clause. So if we're looking back at this sentence, you see the dum right here. There's your conjunction. It's introducing the subordinate clause. If we get rid of the main clause and just look at the subordinate, you'll see it doesn't stand alone as its own sentence. While the Corneliuses eat dinner. Something's missing here. The second part of the sentence is the main clause, the part that can be its own sentence. The soldier tells a story. So if we think about what's happening here, the subordinate clause is giving more information about the main clause. So in other words, what's going on while the soldier's telling a story? Well, while he's telling a story, the Corneliuses are eating dinner. It's giving you more information. Again, if we look at that main clause just on its own, you can see it is a sentence. If you wrote mīles fābulam narrat, you're saying the soldier tells a story. That is its own sentence. Let's look at these sentences one more time to really understand what's going on here. So if we look at the top sentence, we have the same one from before. While the Corneliuses eat dinner, the soldier tells a story. Look at the second sentence though. We've changed the tense around. Now you have while the Corneliuses were eating dinner, the soldier was telling a story. In both sentences, the subordinate clause is basically the same idea. While the Corneliuses either eat or were eating dinner. They're both introduced by dum, which tells you it's a subordinate clause. The only thing we've changed is the tense. Look at the first sentence. The subordinate clause is while the Corneliuses eat dinner. The main clause verb is narat, which says the soldier tells a story. Kenant and narat are both in the present tense. Look what happens when we change the subordinate clause verb though. Instead of kenant, you have kenaban, which means the Corneliuses were eating. Now the main clause verb is narabat, which means the soldier was telling a story. You flipped both verbs to the imperfect tense. This brings you to some basic rules that'll help you understand this. The first is that when the subordinate clause verb and the main clause verb are in the present tense, the sentence is describing two actions that take place at the exact same time. The example for this is the first sentence we looked at. While the Corneliuses eat dinner, the soldier tells a story. Both verbs are in the present tense, so you're saying they're happening at the same time in the present. They're ongoing at the exact same time. The second rule is that when the subordinate clause verb and the main clause verb are in the imperfect tense, the sentence is describing two actions that took place at the same time, but in the past. That's the difference. Now we're talking about two things in the past. This is the second sentence we looked at. While the Corneliuses were eating dinner, the soldier was telling a story. Both the verbs kenabant and narabat are in the imperfect tense. You're saying that they happened at the exact same time, but they happened in the past. This brings us to the third example, and this sentence is slightly different. You have dum Cornelii cibum devorant, subito intravit mīles quidam. It means while the Corneliuses were eating their food, suddenly a certain soldier entered. Now take a look at the verb here. The subordinate clause verb is devorant, which means they are eating. But look at the way we've translated it. You don't say the Corneliuses are eating food. You're saying the Corneliuses were eating their food. So something has happened here where even though it's in the present tense, we're translating it as if it were imperfect. Look at the main clause. You have intravit, the soldier entered. This verb, intravit, is in the perfect tense. So you're talking about an action in the past that happened and was done with. It wasn't an ongoing action. And it kind of makes sense because if a soldier suddenly enters, that's not really over a period of time. It's a sudden event. So it makes sense that it would be in the perfect tense. This brings us to the third rule. When the subordinate clause verb is in the present tense and the main clause verb is in the perfect tense, what you're doing is the sentence is describing an action that was happening over a period of time in the past when suddenly a single action occurred. So in other words, the family was eating and suddenly something interrupted. So we're talking about an interruption. The way you show that in Latin is by having the subordinate clause in the present tense, the main clause in the perfect. That's how you can show this. So if we think back to our sentence, you have the present tense, devorant, and you have the perfect tense, intravit. Intravit is trying to show an interruption in the story. The Corneliuses were eating their food, suddenly a soldier entered. That's one way that you're going to see the subordinate clause used. That's a little tricky because if you're translating it without knowing this, you're not necessarily going to get the idea of the Corneliuses were eating their food, an ongoing action. You might say they are eating their food, but you really want to translate it with the imperfect tense. So just a quick recap. Subordinate clauses, introduced by the conjunction dum, are ones that provide more information about the main clause of the sentence, but don't form a complete sentence on their own. The second rule is that there are three different tenses we can use in subordinate clauses, so the verbs can be in three different tenses. This chart gets the idea of the three tenses. So if we look in the main clause column, the middle column, you have present tense, imperfect, and perfect. Look at the subordinate column though. We have present tense, imperfect, and present. So there's a slight difference here. When both verbs, subordinate and main, are in the present tense, you're talking about two actions happening at the same time in the present. When both verbs, subordinate and main, are in the imperfect tense, you're talking about two actions happening at the same time, but they're in the past. When you have the main clause perfect and the subordinate present, you're talking about one action that was continuing over a period of time that has a sudden almost interruption. A single action occurs that interrupts the present tense action. So that's the example we did of while the Corneliuses were eating, suddenly a certain soldier entered. That's what you're trying to show when you use the verbs in those tenses. This brings us to the next part of the grammar, which is a recap on uses of the infinitive that we've seen so far. So there's not really anything new here, it's just taking all the infinitive uses that we've seen in the first 19 chapters of the book and condensing them into one unit for you to compare them and understand them a little better. So just a quick recap. You want to remember the infinitive of a verb is the form that has no person attached to it. So in Latin and in English, we always translate it to do something, and in Latin the infinitive always ends in an re. So in other words, if you had the verb ascendere, it means to climb. It doesn't mean I climb or you climb or they climb. There's no person attached to it. It's more general than that. It means to do something. That's what the infinitive that you learned back in chapter 4 early on in the book, that's what you first learned. It's the general form of a verb with no person attached. So again, whenever you see a verb ending in re, it means to do something. So far, you've seen the infinitive case being used in a variety of ways. The first was the complementary infinitive. The second was the infinitive with impersonals. The third was the infinitive as the subject of est. And the fourth is what we call the accusative and infinitive construction. So the complementary infinitive, it's basically when you have a main verb that needs its meaning completed. So in other words, the complementary infinitive is used to complete the meaning of a main verb. So if we look at this sentence here, you have Marcus does not want to climb trees. The main verb here is non wollt. So Marcus does not want. And you're asking the question, he doesn't want what? What does he not want to do? The answer is the infinitive, ascendere. You're saying he doesn't want to climb. The infinitive here is completing the meaning of non wollt. So in other words, without the infinitive, you're not really sure what Marcus doesn't want. You need it to be completed. That's what the infinitive is doing here, ascendere, to climb. And again, if you think of it this way, ascendere is answering the question of the main verb. So in other words, Marcus doesn't want what? To climb. These two go together. Main verbs that most often use the complementary infinitive are words like nole, which means to not want, solere, which means to be accustomed to, parare, to prepare, posse, to be able, timere, to be afraid, and velle, which means to want. And if you think about all these words, it makes sense that they would take an infinitive. So in other words, if you had solere, to be accustomed, you'd want to say to be accustomed to do what? The same goes for the rest of them. To prepare, to do what? To be afraid, to do what? To want, to do what? There's going to be an infinitive, most often, used with all of these main verbs. That's the complementary infinitive. The second use is the infinitive with impersonals. So if we think of the phrases necesse est and the verb licet, these are what we call impersonals in the book, because we have to supply the subject of it. So in other words, if you had these two sentences, necesse est dormire and licet ne nobis hic cenare, both of them don't have an explicit subject. We use the word it. So in the first sentence, necesse est, you're saying it is necessary. In the second sentence, licet ne, and remember the ne just means you're asking a yes or no question. Licet means it is permitted. So again, in both sentences, we're supplying it. This is what we mean by impersonal. And again, look at how both of these sentences are finished. You have dormire and cenare. They're both infinitives. So you're saying, it is necessary to do what? To sleep. Is it permitted for us to do what? To eat. So again, both of these sentences are going to use the infinitive to complete the meaning. So if we look at the first sentence, to sleep is necessary, or in other words, it is necessary to sleep, the infinitive is used. In the second sentence, you have to eat here is permitted for us. Or if we flip it around, you're saying, is it permitted for us to eat here? That's really what you're asking. Again, you use the infinitive. The third option is the infinitive as the subject of est. And this is something we've seen, but I don't think we've actually explained it in great detail. So when used as the subject of est, the infinitive is really acting as a verbal noun. So what do I mean by that? Take a look at this sentence. If you have pernoctare est periculosum, we would translate this as to spend the night is dangerous. If we break it down into the pieces of the sentence, you'll recognize est as being your linking verb. Pernoctare is really acting as the subject. You're saying what is dangerous? To spend the night. In that sense, even though it's a verb, it's really acting more like a noun and the subject of your sentence. Periculosum would simply be the complement. And again, we would translate this to spend the night is dangerous. In this example, even though it's a verb, technically, the infinitive, it's really acting like a noun. You'll see this occasionally. So when you see the verb est, the linking verb, if there's no explicit subject and you see an infinitive going with it, there's a really good chance the infinitive is the subject. The fourth way that we use the infinitive is with the accusative. This construction we learned a few chapters back, but basically the infinitive is often used with the verb to teach and to order, and it takes an accusative direct object. So what do I mean by that? If we have this sentence, Aurelia Corneliam docet velam curare, the subject is Aurelia. What is she doing? She's teaching. Who is she teaching? Cornelia. So that's the main part of this sentence. Aurelia teaches Cornelia. And the endings and the way the verb is set up, it all tells us what's going on in a very straightforward way. Aurelia is teaching Cornelia. This makes docet really a transitive verb, which is something we've seen before. Curare is the infinitive though, so you have to think of how this all fits in. You're saying Aurelia teaches Cornelia what? To take care of. Then you finish the sentence by saying to take care of what? The house. That's your second direct object. So here we have the infinitive going with the accusative, velam. It's another construction we've seen. It's not too hard to figure out, but again, when you notice an accusative with an infinitive, this is usually what's going on. You'll have the verb to teach or to order, and then you have an infinitive and an accusative direct object. And again, the translation, very straightforward. Aurelia teaches Cornelia to look after or to take care of the house. This brings us to the next part of grammar for this chapter, and it's a big one. It's principal parts. This is an idea that we've seen and we've talked about in the past, but we haven't really gone over in great detail, so we're going to really flesh it out in this chapter to make sure you understand. So far, our book has listed verbs with two parts, the first person singular in the present tense and the infinitive. So for instance, if we had the verb to prepare, paro parare, paro is the first person singular. It means I prepare. Parare is the infinitive. It means to prepare. These two pieces are always given in our book. Moving forward though, we're going to get a bit more information for each verb. So every time you see a new verb, or if you look in the back of the book in the dictionary, you're going to see 4 different parts. These are what we call the principal parts of a verb. So if we take that same verb to prepare, you can expand it by adding 2 more parts. So now we have paro, parare, paravi, paratus. The first part means the same thing as before. It's the first person singular present tense, I prepare. Parare is still the infinitive, to prepare. Paravi is the first person singular in the perfect tense. And you can see the V infix and the long I ending give it away as perfect tense. And you'll see as we move forward why this is very important. The fourth principal part is something called the perfect passive participle. This isn't something we're going to spend a lot of time on now because you're going to learn much more about this as you move on through this book and the second Ecce Romani textbook. But whenever you see a verb, you always want to look in the dictionary at the 4 different principal parts because they're giving you very specific and important information. So again, the way we translate these, you have paro, I prepare, parare, to prepare, paravi, I prepared, and paratus means having been prepared. Again, the 4th principal part is not something we're going to spend a ton of time on, but it's something I just want you to see now that we're in this chapter. For what we're really going to be doing here, the first 3 principal parts are very important, and these are the ones that we're going to be focusing on. The 4th principal part is usually the perfect passive participle, and when we get into it, you'll see there's one other option it could be, but it has the endings of a first and second declension adjective, and it sometimes just acts as a simple adjective, having been prepared. This is something we're not going to get into a lot again in this video, but when you're learning verbs and memorizing them, make sure you include all 4 principal parts, because you're going to be at a real disadvantage if you get later on in the book when we're using the 4th principal part and you can't remember what it is or what it looks like. So just make sure that when you're doing your memorizing, you have all 4 principal parts with each verb. One thing to note is that intransitive verbs don't have a perfect passive participle. So instead, you're going to see the 4th principal part as a future active participle. And again, like I said, we'll go into this in much more detail, but sometimes the spelling is going to be a little different in this 4th principal part. Don't freak out or get really nervous. It's just a different form that you're going to see is important, but it's not something we're really going to cover yet. Verbs of the 1st, 2nd, and 4th conjugations follow a set pattern in their principal parts, and it looks like this. These 3 verbs, parare, habere, and audire, are kind of representative of the 1st, 2nd, and 4th conjugation. One thing to note, they're not always going to follow this pattern. It's more of a guideline, but let's look at what's going on here. In the first part, you can see this is a 1st conjugation verb, and it has a formula for what the principal parts are. The key to notice here is in the 3rd principal part, you have an AVI. V is the infix for most 1st conjugation verbs in the perfect tense. So if you can remember that V, it'll help you when it comes time to spelling these words. For the 4th principal part, you're going to see the pattern here is the ATUS with the long A. That's usual for 1st conjugation verbs. The 2nd conjugation follows a slightly different pattern. We know this is 2nd conjugation because the infinitive has long ERE, but look at the perfect tense. Here we have a U with a long I. That's a pretty general pattern for 2nd conjugation verbs. In this verb, again, the 4th principal part, ending with the US, the TUS in this case, it's a pretty general pattern. Here we have a 4th conjugation verb, and we can tell this by looking at the infinitive. The 2nd principal part has a long IRE. It's a 4th conjugation verb. Take a look at the 3rd principal part. Here we have another V. It's similar to 1st conjugation, which used AVI. 4th conjugation often uses IVI. Slight difference, but it's not too bad of a pattern to remember. And again, this is just a general rule, but many 4th conjugation verbs will use an IVI for the perfect tense. The 4th principal part, again, pretty standard. You're going to notice the US ending. And remember, this is an adjective, so it's technically us, but for our purposes, we'll just use the US. It's following a pretty set pattern. So just to recap what we just covered. Verbs have 4 principal parts. The 1st person, present singular, that's what we call the 1st principal part. The 2nd principal part is the infinitive. The 3rd principal part is the 1st person singular perfect tense. And the 4th principal part is the perfect active participle. These principal parts have a set pattern in the 1st, 2nd, and 4th conjugation. It's not a perfect formula, but in general, this pattern will most often work. So it's worth memorizing. Principal parts of 3rd conjugation verbs and irregular verbs are going to be given to you in the vocab list. There's no real set pattern. It can be a variety of different things. So whenever you have a 3rd conjugation verb or a verb that's irregular, your book will give you the different principal parts in the vocab. You want to make sure you're memorizing them. And again, that goes for any verb that you're working on. It's really important to memorize the principal parts because they're giving you really important and necessary information for all the tenses of Latin verbs. So far, we've only seen present, imperfect, and perfect tense, but as you move on in the book, the last 3 tenses are based off these principal parts, so it's really important that you have all of them before you move on.